What happens when a corrupt judge uses her power to ruin lives? How far will one man go to expose the truth, even when the system is stacked against him? In a courtroom where bias runs deep, a defense attorney faces the challenge of a lifetime. Can he stand up to the arrogance of a powerful figure, or will justice be silenced forever? Watch as this battle for truth unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories. The King County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, stood as a monument to power and control. For 20 years, its marble floors had echoed under the steady march of countless cases, but one name had been etched into its walls far more indelibly than any other: Judge Jordan Wallace. A towering figure in the legal world, Wallace ruled over her courtroom with an iron fist, her gavel delivering decisions that were often as harsh as they were final. Her reputation stretched far beyond the courthouse, and for good reason. Judge Wallace was not merely an authority figure. She saw herself as the sole arbiter of what was just. Her word was law, and anyone who dared to challenge that law was met with disdain. A woman of unshakable self-confidence, she never made eye contact with anyone who stood before her in court, as though the act of looking them in the eye would somehow lower her status. Her piercing gaze, hidden behind dark framed glasses, always seemed to look through the attorneys and defendants, never at them. What made Wallace particularly feared was her open contempt for those who didn't fit her narrow view of the world. Black attorneys, especially, knew they were at a severe disadvantage when their cases landed in her courtroom. She didn't need to say it out loud. The message was clear. Her rulings were often biased, her decisions lopsided, and her disregard for fairness almost palpable. For anyone who was brave enough to try and question her, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. Careers were ruined with a single ruling, and reputations were shredded without a moment's hesitation. The courthouse itself seemed to hum with a low, constant tension, a heavy air that hung around the walls like a bad omen. It wasn't just the weight of the cases being decided, but the atmosphere created by Wallace's presence. Attorneys who had to appear before her had long since learned the unspoken rules. She was untouchable. To challenge her was to invite professional ruin. Everyone knew that speaking out against her or standing up for what was right could quickly lead to being blackballed from the legal community. Judge Wallace had carved out a legacy for herself, but it was a legacy built on the fear she instilled in those around her, a legacy that few were brave enough to question. It was in this courtroom, under her watchful eyes, that the fight for justice would soon be tested. Malik Foster's footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floor of the King County Courthouse. At 45 years old, Malik had made a name for himself in the legal world as a defense attorney willing to take on the cases that others wouldn't dare touch. His career had not been handed to him on a silver platter, far from it. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, he had grown up with an awareness of how the system could fail people like him, people who didn't have the connections or privilege to navigate the complexities of the law. He knew that to make it in this world, he had to work harder than anyone else, and that's exactly what he did. He started his career with nothing but the drive to help those who were often overlooked and underserved by the justice system. His reputation grew over the years, not through flashy publicity or winning easy cases, but by taking on the tough ones, the cases where the odds were stacked against his clients, where the system was broken and the outcome seemed predetermined. Malik had become known as someone who would never back down, even in the face of the harshest challenges. But today was different. Malik could feel it in his bones as he approached the courtroom. It wasn't just another case, another client to defend. Today, Malik wasn't just standing up for his client, he was standing up against Judge Jordan Wallace. Over the years, he had heard the whispers, The stories about how Wallace would bend the law to fit her personal views, how she would often dismiss arguments from black attorneys with a glance, a word, or a swift ruling. He had seen her injustice firsthand, and he knew that today would not be a simple trial. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes instinctively sought out the judge. There she was, sitting high above everyone else at the bench, the familiar air of authority radiating from her like an impenetrable wall. She didn't look up as Malik walked in. He wasn't surprised. This was how it always was. He could feel her eyes on him even without a glance, a cold, dismissive gaze that told him all he needed to know. Judge Wallace had already made up her mind about him before he even said a word. It wasn't about the case or the facts. It was about who he was, and that was something she could never tolerate. Malik's pulse quickened as he took his place at the defense table, the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. He didn't let his outward expression betray the nervous tension inside. He had been in hostile environments before, but something about this felt different. This was a battle for more than just a case. It was a fight for justice, for the very integrity of the system that Wallace had so blatantly corrupted. Judge Wallace finally lifted her gaze, her eyes narrowing as they met his. The tension between them was palpable, as thick as the air in the courtroom. She didn't even acknowledge him with a greeting. Instead, her voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "I don't want any theatrics, Malik," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "Keep it professional." Her words hit him like a slap, but Malik knew better than to show any sign of weakness. He had heard it all before, the veiled insults, the undercurrent of contempt in her voice. It was part of the game she played, and he wasn't going to let her intimidate him. "I'll keep it professional, Your Honor," he replied calmly, his voice steady and firm. But in the back of his mind, Malik knew this was more than just a trial. It was a reckoning. Today, he wasn't just defending his client. He was going to take down the arrogance and corruption that had plagued this courthouse for far too long. The courtroom felt suffocating as Malik settled into his seat. His hands rested on the table, fingers lightly tapping in rhythm with his thoughts. The trial had barely begun, but it was already clear to him that it wouldn't be a fair fight. Judge Wallace was more interested in shutting him down than allowing the truth to be heard. It started with the first legal objection he raised. The prosecution had introduced a key piece of evidence that Malik knew was inadmissible, evidence that was neither disclosed during discovery nor relevant to the case at hand. He stood up, his voice steady but firm, ready to make his argument. "Your Honor," Malik began, addressing Wallace, "I move to strike the evidence introduced by the prosecution. It was not disclosed to the defense and is therefore a violation of our rights under Brady v. Maryland." The room fell silent, all eyes on the judge as she slowly adjusted her glasses. Wallace didn't look up from her paperwork. She didn't even acknowledge the gravity of Malik's argument. With a barely perceptible sigh, she waved her hand dismissively. "Denied," she muttered without a second thought, as though the motion were an inconvenience, not a violation of the law. Malik's jaw tightened, but he didn't show any frustration. This wasn't unexpected. He had been in courtrooms like this before, where the judge's ruling was always skewed, where the law was something to be bent to fit the whims of the powerful. But today, it wasn't just his client's fate at stake. It was about justice. The trial proceeded with a pace that felt increasingly like a performance rather than a search for truth. Wallace allowed the prosecution to weave their narrative unchecked, nodding approvingly at each of their arguments. She guided the young assistant district attorney, Philip Calloway, through each step of his case, whispering suggestions and offering subtle cues as though they were partners in a play rather than adversaries in a courtroom. Malik watched in disbelief. Every argument he raised, no matter how valid, was dismissed outright. Each objection was met with a wave of her hand, as though his voice had no weight, no bearing on the proceedings. She spoke to him like he was an annoying child, not a trained professional. Her rulings were sharp, and her biases were transparent. But this wasn't just about his client. Malik was no stranger to difficult cases, but he was determined to expose Wallace's bias and manipulation. This was more than a legal battle. This was a fight for the integrity of the justice system itself. He knew he was up against a formidable opponent, someone who had spent decades twisting the law to her advantage. But Malik was prepared. He had spent years meticulously documenting Wallace's corruption. The evidence was there, and he wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. As the trial wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. Malik could feel the discomfort radiating from the jury. He watched as they shifted in their seats, some of them casting furtive glances at one another. They could see what was happening. They could feel the weight of the injustice, but they were too afraid to speak up. The courtroom was a battlefield, and every ruling, every subtle insult from Wallace chipped away at the veneer of fairness that was supposed to be the foundation of this trial. The gallery was no different. Malik could see the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, their eyes darting between the judge, the prosecution, and him. Some of them clearly noticed the way Wallace was siding with the prosecution, how she had been so quick to dismiss every motion Malik raised. There were whispers in the crowd, murmurs of disapproval that Malik knew wouldn't reach the judge's ears. But it was enough to make him feel like he wasn't alone in this fight. Despite the growing tension, Malik remained calm. He had learned long ago that in battles like this, you didn't rush in head first. You had to wait for the right moment. Wallace had made it clear she wasn't going to give him a fair trial. But he wasn't here just to win a case. He was here to expose her for what she was. He was playing the long game, carefully orchestrating each move with precision. Every time Wallace dismissed him, every time she overruled his objections with a flick of her wrist, he knew he was one step closer to her undoing. Malik knew that pushing her too hard, too fast, would only make things worse. She was already defensive. Every glance she cast his way was filled with contempt, and every time she spoke to him, her words dripped with scorn. If he pressed her too quickly, she would only retaliate with more authority, more venom. He needed to let her build up, to show the jury just how deeply she had corrupted the proceedings. He couldn't expose her all at once. He had to let her do it herself. So he waited, and he watched. And when the moment came, he would strike not with force but with the weight of the truth. He would force Wallace to reveal herself for the fraud she was. Because Malik knew justice always had a way of coming to light, even in the darkest of places. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with the unspoken animosity between Judge Wallace and Malik. Every word Malik spoke was a challenge. Every objection he raised was met with swift dismissal. The case was moving as expected, with Wallace continuing to control the proceedings with an iron fist. But then, the unexpected happened. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom suddenly swung open, causing everyone to look toward the entrance. Two federal agents, their faces stern and unreadable, stepped in, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. Their presence was immediate and commanding, demanding the attention of every person in the room. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment the room fell eerily silent. Judge Wallace looked up, her eyes narrowing in irritation as she sized up the intruders. She was used to commanding attention, not yielding it. For a moment, she simply stared, her expression one of confusion, as if she couldn't quite fathom why anyone would dare interrupt her court session. Her jaw tightened as the agents advanced, their movement crisp and purposeful. One of the agents stepped forward and cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "Judge Jordan Wallace, we need to speak with you immediately." The words hit the room like a shockwave, causing the tension to spike. Wallace's expression twisted into a mask of defiance, and she straightened her back in her chair, her gaze cold and commanding. "This is highly inappropriate," Wallace snapped, her voice carrying authority. "I'm in the middle of a trial. Whatever this is, it will have to wait until the proceedings are concluded." But the agent wasn't swayed. His eyes locked with hers, unflinching. "This matter cannot wait, Your Honor." Wallace's eyes flashed with irritation, but she held her ground. "I said no, we are not taking a recess." Her voice was ice as she tried to reassert control over the room. "The defense has wasted enough of this court's time. We will not be delayed further." The agent, however, stood firm. "We have a warrant for your arrest," he declared, pulling a folded document from his jacket and holding it up for all to see. "Judge Wallace, you are under arrest on charges of bribery, abuse of power, and violations of civil rights under federal law." The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the gallery as people exchanged wide-eyed glances. The prosecution, who had once feared her, now seemed just as stunned as everyone else. Even the jury, who had been quietly observing the trial, were taken aback by the revelation. Wallace's face drained of color. For the first time in the years she had dominated the courtroom, her authority seemed to crack. She stared at the agents, then at the paper in their hands as if unable to comprehend what was happening. The courtroom, once a place of her unchallenged rule, now felt like a place of judgment for her. Her eyes narrowed with barely concealed rage as she tried to assert control. "This is outrageous," she spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You can't do this, I'm the judge here." But the agents didn't budge. They were calm, methodical, and undeterred. They moved toward her, ready to carry out their duty, and Wallace, despite her protestations, could do nothing to stop them. As the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, a sense of disbelief washed over the entire courtroom. The woman who had held the gavel for over 2 decades, who had passed judgment on so many others, was now the one being led away in cuffs. It was an image that none of them, not even Malik, could have ever anticipated seeing. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in quiet satisfaction. For years, Judge Wallace had been untouchable. Now her reign was over. The courtroom, which had once been dominated by her presence, was now a place where justice had finally come full circle. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression calm, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he knew would come, but he never imagined it would happen like this. The courtroom was still as the federal agents moved swiftly toward Judge Wallace. One agent unfurled the arrest warrant, his voice clear and final. "Judge Jordan Wallace, you are under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, and violations of civil rights under federal law." Gasps of disbelief spread throughout the room. For a moment, the once commanding figure of Judge Wallace seemed to lose all her power. She tried to assert herself, her voice sharp with anger, but it was no use. The agents, unwavering in their task, swiftly cuffed her, and the courtroom could only watch in stunned silence as the once imposing judge was taken down. Malik remained calm, his eyes locked on the scene. This was the moment he had waited for, the culmination of years of work to expose the corruption that had plagued the courthouse. Wallace, who had once controlled everything in this room, was now just another defendant, her reign over the courtroom shattered in an instant. As Wallace was led away, Malik turned toward Tyrone Robinson, his client. Tyrone, who had been wrongly accused and trapped under the weight of Wallace's unjust rulings, stood up in disbelief. The handcuffs that had bound him were now removed. The freedom Malik had fought so hard to secure was now his. Tyrone's voice trembled as he spoke. I don't even know what to say." Malik, his heart pounding with a quiet sense of victory, placed a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. You're free." The fight for justice was hard won, but Malik knew that this was just the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but for Malik, the weight of the moment was clear. Justice was never too late. He had fought tirelessly, not just to secure his client's freedom, but to expose the deep-rooted corruption that had pervaded the system for far too long. Today, Malik's victory wasn't just about one case. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and the unwavering belief in justice, even when the odds were stacked against him. For years, the system had been bent to the will of those in power, with people like Judge Wallace exploiting their positions for personal gain. Yet, Malik's fight proved that no matter how deeply corruption is embedded, there will always be those willing to challenge it. His relentless pursuit of truth and fairness had exposed the flaws within the system, showing that even the most powerful figures could be held accountable. But Malik knew this was not the end. While his victory was significant, it was only a small step toward the larger fight that lay ahead. The system was still fraught with corruption, and many others remained oppressed by the same injustices that Tyrone had faced. Malik's triumph was a beacon, but it was just the beginning of the long road toward real change. The fight for justice would continue, and it would take the collective effort of many to ensure that it prevailed. The story ended with a call to action, urging others to stand up against corruption, to keep fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. Malik's victory showed that, when the law is allowed to work fairly, justice is possible for all.